Welcome to the Perfectly Flawed podcast, where we share conversations with amazing people who have achieved extraordinary success through embracing their struggles and imperfections. Often they have succeeded not just despite their perceived flaws, but because of them too. Please do subscribe, leave a review, and share this with anyone else who you think might be interested. On this first episode of the Perfectly Flawed podcast, instead of me interviewing my guest, I've brought in my guest, Duncan Bascaran-Brown, to interview me about why I've set up this podcast, what it's all about, and what the concept of perfectly flawed really means to me. Hope you enjoy it.
All right then, are you doing the intro or am I?
I'm going to start. Hello and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Perfectly Flawed. And today, because it's the inaugural podcast, I'm going to start again.
I think mucking up the intro is kind of flawed. Anyway.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Okay, good. Well, we could start with it like that. But I'm welcoming everybody. Welcome to the inaugural podcast of Perfectly Flawed. And because this is the first one, rather than interview my guest, I've invited a guest to interview me. So I'd really like to welcome Duncan Bascaran-Brown.
Who is not a guest.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't really say.
No. We know each other too well.
You are an author, a speaker, and a Morris dancer, among other things, and also the author of two brilliant books, and I think you've probably written more, but the two that I've read are Real Men Quit. I'm not saying that I'm a real man, but who knows? We'll find out. Real Men Quit, which is about giving up drinking, and another one on overcoming overindulgence. And they're full of humour and wit, but also some great thought-provoking and penetrating and usable ideas. And I know you don't have to laugh when
I'm just thinking they're also full of quite a few flaws, but
well, that's the beauty of it, as we will discover. So I've invited you today. You know about behaviours, you know about how behaviours lead to results. I've brought you here because you are a challenging human being. You're not going to let anyone get away with saying anything that doesn't really quite add up. But you're also very compassionate, you're very insightful, and you're a lot of fun, and I enjoy your company. So I thought, who better to entrust this first episode with to help me find out what this Perfectly Flawed podcast is really about than you. You're the ideal candidate. In fact, a bit terrifying because I know you've done, you've led hundreds of podcasts. You've not only been a guest, but you've also done your own. What's the name of your podcast?
It's called Flat Pack Sober, and there we get into the kind of flaws that people have around alcohol, how they got out again, but more importantly, we like to do the stuff that keeps people sober. I think that's one of the things that most people miss. They talk a lot about how you do the initial change, but they don't talk about how you maintain it. So that's what we try to do.
So this podcast isn't necessarily about sobriety, or that may be something that comes up to people. But this is a podcast around all of our flaws and how often our greatest flaws, our greatest failures, the messes we've made of our life and our own inadequacies are often our greatest assets. And if we can really understand how those flaws contribute to us being some kind of useful member of society in some way and contribute to what we have to offer the world and to fulfilling our purpose, then I think we're on to a winner.
Yeah, so I suppose this is a point where I start asking questions, right?
You can. We haven't structured this out too boldly, so
No, but as you did point out, in a sort of fairly nice way, I am quite disagreeable. So I guess I better ask you some really difficult, penetrating questions.
You can do.
Yeah.
Whether I'll respond well to them, it remains to be seen. But I'm here to share my flaws, and actually, I think just while it's in my mind, I think one of the big points about this podcast is about thinking about where the cracks bring the light in. We were talking about Leonard Cohen.
We were indeed talking about Leonard Cohen. I'm a big fan of Leonard Cohen, and particularly that song Anthem. You know, the crack is where it lets the light in. So, well, let's start with your cracks then. What are your flaws?
We can start with my flaws. I also think that we mustn't forget the Japanese art of kintsugi while we're talking about cracks that let the light in. So I will come to my flaws. I'm not trying to avoid them. I've just got that image of the kintsugi vase, which is the Japanese art of there being a broken piece of pottery that is put together with gold. And that's what makes it beautiful. It's broken into 1,000 pieces, and then the gold is what glues it back together. And that is really, I think, what I've discovered through my life. So, yes, I'm an incredibly flawed person, like many of us. And I put my hands up to my multiple flaws. So I'm qualified from the flawed bit. It's called Perfectly Flawed because in the end, that's what makes us. It's perfectly okay. It's perfectly reasonable to be flawed. It's our imperfections that make us perfect. Otherwise, you know, if a tree had no flaws, it would look like a telegraph pole.
Okay.
It would be very boring. And flowers that don't have flaws, that are sort of ultra perfect, are just sort of almost too much for us to contain. So what does it mean to be a perfect person is kind of really what causes the problems. We try to be a perfect person. So I grew up as a child who was very happy. I had a very idyllic, joyful childhood with no real self-awareness. I grew up in Hong Kong, an expat. We spent a lot of time in the water and the sunshine. And the first cracks really appeared in my life when my parents got separated and my family life as I knew it fell apart. And I was sent off to a boarding school and was not particularly well received. I wasn't sent into the arms of people that loved and cared for me. I enjoyed it in parts. There were quite a lot of pretty devastating reports, which I've picked up again recently and read, and they put me into a real slump for about 2 weeks because these reports seem to say things like she could try harder, she could be more, she needs to apply herself. And, you know, and these things, when you're a child who you're getting on with your life, you don't even think about it, and suddenly you're made to feel as though you're sort of unwanted. There's no real structure. There's no going back to mother and father or a family life that said you're okay. And so I did feel pretty flawed in that sense, yeah.
Is that then that, you know, you thought you were living this perfect life? You thought your parents had this perfect relationship, and then all of a sudden it kind of seemed to, well, be a bit more flawed than you perhaps thought it was?
Yeah, I think it was that. I think up until that point, and I think many children have this perspective on the world, there's goodies and baddies, and there's sort of, it's kind of, it's very binary. It's either the world is a good place or it's not. And things are good and people are good, or they're not. And then suddenly I had two parents who weren't getting on and a lifestyle that wasn't perfect. And yes, I knew that both my parents weren't bad people. And it's just trying to come to terms with all of that the world was not as I thought it was.
Is that something that you're supposed to realise a bit slower than you did? And it was a bit of a kind of a crunch.
I think that's probably it. Yeah, it's usually something that comes upon you over time. But it was sort of suddenly at 11, I had a heartbroken father who would cry on my shoulder, and my role was very much I felt my role was to make him feel better. So I sort of looked after him. I had no idea how I felt emotionally about all of this, because I think I wasn't old enough or mature enough to really be aware of what my feelings were. So I saw my father was heartbroken and devastated, and so my attention was, or my life focus was about looking after him. And so anyway, I went to a number of different schools, but also my father then met and somebody and remarried. And again, I felt, what's my role now? Where do I fit with all of this? I didn't really know how to be a regular daughter to my father and where I had any value. I knew I had value when I was making him feel better, which inevitably led to a career as a therapist. Because that was what I was used to helping, getting my value and my worth from helping other people discover how they can, helping people to feel better about who they are.
For sure. And obviously, we tend to try and encourage helping other people. There's nothing wrong with that. It's kind of a good thing. But did that help Deborah?
Well, Deborah derived much of her self-worth through making other people feel, valued. And that went on for quite a long time. I mean, I was in my early mid-30s when I spent 5 years working with people in addiction recovery, drug and alcohol recovery. And while I didn't have a dependency on drugs and alcohol, I think for me it was a period of recovery as well. It was a period of reevaluating my entire belief system, just as the people I was working with were doing. So their way of life had come to a standstill. They knew they had to change things. They'd reevaluate their beliefs and their opinions, their ideas, and their identity. And I was simultaneously doing the same thing. And when it got to the end of that 5-year period, I thought, well, I've been in the same windowless room with the same groups or similar groups of people, helping them change and transform. And I've got a little bit stuck. So I was ready for a new life. But before we sort of come on to new life, I just want to share a few more flaws that I have.
Well, Duncan likes talking about himself in the third person too. And Duncan is quite interested in hearing some of your other flaws.
Great, it's great because I think there's something quite liberating about owning up to our flaws, and actually I think it makes us quite robust when other people can attack us for our flaws and say, this is what's wrong with you. You're so this, you're so that. But if you get there first, it can be a kind of almost like a great line of defense. And it reminds me of with a comedian, if a comedian comes up to the stage and doesn't recognize what's screamingly obvious to the viewer, they don't recognize that they've got an unusual, a thick Russian accent and they might be in Britain. And if they don't say something about that, or if they're very, very tall or whatever it is, if they don't draw attention to it, then people are going to be distracted by it. And you and I both work as speakers as well. So the same thing applies to us as speakers. When we get up on stage, we do need to recognise what's different and unusual about us. And these aren't flaws, but they can be perceived as flaws. So one of the most painful, difficult and challenging things I've done in speaking was to do a comedy course. And I realised that the one thing you don't want people to spot about you is almost the very first thing you've got to draw people's attention to. And you really hope they don't notice it.
Yeah, but I mean, that being said, talking to Beth Sherman, who is a friend of ours and a very well-respected comic scriptwriter, one of the things she says is, take that thing that everybody notices about you and make a joke about it right at the start, because it is a great way to build rapport. So why is it that talking about your flaws and talking about what's not so great about you, why does that create connection? Why does that create rapport?
Well, I think because of the huge honesty there is, it's the one thing we don't want to look at, or it's the area we most want to deny or distort because it's uncomfortable for us. We're ashamed of it. So we turn away from those flaws, or, as Jung would call it, our shadows. So our shadows are the area that we just feel are most uncomfortable. But when we can turn towards those shadows, the things that we're ashamed of, that we don't want people to know about us, and when we can turn towards them with a bit of compassion and allow them to sort of exist, those things get transmuted. And I suppose what I really want to say with being perfect, the perfectly flawed idea, is that we become far greater when we embrace them. So one of the areas for me is, one of the reasons I struggled at school was because I was quite non-conformist. I was a bit quirky. I'd come from outside. I'd come from a different culture, really, in Hong Kong. And I suddenly found myself in these British boarding schools, and I went to a number of different ones. And I knew already this wasn't whatever people believed to be so, to believe, the paradigm or the idea or the belief system everybody believed. I knew that there were other cultural differences, different ways of looking at the world from what I'd seen of, a lot of Chinese people living in Hong Kong with a very different culture. And also with my parents' separation, and going to a lot of different schools, I recognised that each time I came to one of these institutions or environments, there was a sort of an identity or culture or belief system that was bought into, and I always sat slightly outside it and knew it wasn't the truth. It was just one way of thinking about the world. And I think that's the same when I work with people in addiction recovery. The belief system that people had about their world, for instance, I need to come, I've had a hard day at work and I need to have a drink at the end of the day. I need to. That's what, because I've had a hard day at work. All my friends do it. Everybody drinks to this extent. That's a belief system that was having to be reevaluated because it was no longer serving them. It was eroding them. So with my own experience of going to different schools and different cultures, I discovered that, being nonconformist, as painful as it was in those environments, has now become my greatest asset.
So I mean, obviously everything you say about belief systems and alcohol, I totally and utterly relate to that. But do people really want that, though? I mean, isn't there this danger that if you are kind of saying, look, it could be completely different. Look, we don't have to do it this way. Does that not kind of annoy people and put their backs up a little bit? Isn't there a danger in that?
Well, I know this is an area that you're particularly equipped to answer, and it's a really good point. And yes, it does put people's backs up. The people that dissent, particularly in an organisation that's trying to be a well-oiled machine, are real pains in the arse. You don't want people causing disruption and dissent, but it's the healthiest thing. If there are things wrong and you've got people who are willing to say and do things different, that's important. But I'd say even more pertinently to the world that we're now entering into, the world of AI, machine learning. We've already got robots that can take care of a lot of our jobs. Then the human element is increasingly at a premium. And by the human element, I mean the flawed elements of us being human, as well as the connection points and the compassion. I mean, when I die, I don't want a robot holding my hand. I'd ideally like a loved one, or at least, a kind medical person. But it's not just about compassion. It's about creative thinking, and creative thinking is often slightly flawed. It's often slightly, it's not the beige that AI will pull out of a big sample and take the medium.
Yeah, I definitely see where you're coming from. I mean, I did a little bit of work with a visual artist back in the day, and one of the things he would always say was, you've got to make it perfect, and then you've got to take something away. And I thought, well, if you can do that, I mean, if you can genuinely make it perfect, then good luck. Because I think that's probably quite a high bar to aim for. But is that the definition of human then? I mean, is for you, it's about being honest and recognizing your limitations?
Well, yes, I think that is part of being human. I mean, I think when you say you're only human, you mean, you've got some flaws there. Today I had a little incident with the car. And I made a bit of a scratch on the side of the car. But there was an onlooker who said, "You're only human. It happens to us all." And what he meant was, yeah, we all make mistakes. But, you don't really say that to a computer or to AI. They're not meant to make mistakes. They're not only human, and it's not okay. So, yeah, there is that. But I think there's another side to being human, which is about connection and a sort of intimacy with who we truly are, and an acceptance of who we truly are, which means accepting ourselves with all our flaws and with all our shadows and with all the things that don't quite match up to who we wish we were. We often think, I wish I was, better at this, or I wish I didn't have that trait or that characteristic. I'd be better if I was more perfect. But being human is about embracing the entirety of who we are, which includes the shadow.
And so you just used the word acceptance a couple of times, and I think that that is really key to it, isn't it? Because when you prang your car, there's two ways of looking at it. One, you can get very annoyed with yourself, or you can accept your own humanity. But acceptance is hard, isn't it?
Acceptance is very, very difficult. True acceptance, and we don't go straight into acceptance. I think we start by having to develop a more compassionate way of being in the world. I think if we're always putting everything under scrutiny and we're being really tough about everything, then we're not able to accept things. So yes, first of all, we need to be a bit compassionate, but ultimately we want to go beyond acceptance. I think we want to. What I'm talking about here is embracing those things. Really seeing how the fact that you're a bit disruptive and a bit contrary at times is one of the most wonderful traits about you.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to disagree with that, which is strange because I normally do disagree with things.
You're not going to disagree with being disagreeable.
No, not at all. And it's something that actually, I have actively tried to embrace, be less agreeable, Duncan. But isn't there a danger that I think, I could very easily take it too far and just become... just become not a very nice person to be around. And I have met people who are not particularly pleasant to be around. And, they will often justify that by saying, well, that is who I am. That is just my perfect flaw. So is there a danger of taking it too far?
Oh, I think definitely. I think it's about being rounded and not just leading with our flaws. I think the idea of being perfectly flawed is actually not an excuse for being an unpleasant human being. I think it's almost the opposite to that. It's saying that there is people have different belief systems about this, but I will use the model of the idea of a soul. And I kind of like to believe in that idea of a soul, but it means different things for different people. But I like the idea of us having a higher self or a kind of a part of ourself that is unique to us, kind of a unique essence. And we then kind of have this overlay of personality, which is formed through probably a combination of biology, nature and nurture and experiences. And so we learn how to adapt and how to live in the world and the circumstances that we're given. So that personality is our coping mechanism, and it works for a while, and that's our ego as well. And that sort of helps us get to a certain point in life. But there comes a point at which our soul sort of wants to break out. And our soul comes with the shadow. It is all of us. The soul doesn't think of it. It's not thought of as a shadow. It is who we are. But it wants to break out and stop using the ego and the coping mechanism of the personality. So when people are, really unpleasant or real arseholes or leading with their negative traits, I don't think that they're being the fully rounded human being or the kind of higher self-led or soul-led type of person that they could be. So I feel like I'm going into a bit of an esoteric, perhaps ramble there, but
Well, no, I think there's something very strong in what you're saying, that, these people have found a way of coping with the world, which involves being quite nasty, because that pushes people away and that stops them getting too attached, and you can't get hurt if you don't get too attached. So it becomes kind of like a mechanism for dealing with it, but that's not actually living up to their higher self. That's not a true expression of their soul, and that's what you want people to aspire to truly express their soul.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds quite hard.
I think it's very hard, but we don't get there. We don't get to sort of true self-expression of our soul by denying the bits of us that are unpalatable. So this is where it's about embracing them. So if we really truly want to be fully self-expressed or self-actualized, as Maslow would have said at the top of his hierarchy, we have to then allow for the fact that we may not be the person that would be most approved of by our parents, or most approved of by our culture, or the environment in which we find ourselves, and even ourselves. So we may have this sense of, this is the person I wish I was. And it's quite inconvenient sometimes that actually who we truly are is something else. But taking that, going along that pathway to find out who we are and be guided by perhaps our emotions or our response to things, the deeper response, not the reactive initial thought, defensive thoughts that we might have, but how we really feeling and how we responding in any situation, to really understand what's going on. Let that guide us back to our heart, or to our soul, or to our truth of who we are. And I think that's really what the pathway is. It's a pathway of being broken open by life's irregularities, broken open by the fact that life doesn't always go the way we want it to. And rather than sort of put on, a coat of a persona, instead start to say, well, who am I really within all of this, within the world? When the world breaks us open, it can actually tell us who we truly are. And one of my clients, one of my former addiction clients, saw me at a party a few years later, and he said, I've been 5 years clean, 5 years sober, and this woman taught me how to smile, which was such an amazing gift. But we were chatting, and he said, do you know what God stands for? I said, no. He said, the gift of despair. And I thought about that and thought, yes, for me also, some of the times in my life where life has broken me open, where I thought the world was one way and it turned out to be something different, those have been my gifts of despair, because they've led me closer to who I truly am. And, this happened again when I was, I trained as a clinical hypnotherapist, and I had brought a childbirth process methodology to the UK. It was an American methodology called hypnobirthing, which is now very prevalent in the UK.
Yeah, my wife used it, so thanks for that.
Oh, great. Well, so I brought it to the UK, and it was the first, and helped the mother of the first baby born using the hypnobirthing methodology. And I found myself as a woman who talked about female empowerment, trusting our bodies, trusting the process, and really love the whole thing. I loved being that person. I felt as though I had a mission in life, and I had a real purpose, and I knew what I was about, and it was about reclaiming childbirth. And so when I found myself pregnant, that was a wonderful thing, and it was part of this whole Earth Mother vibe that I was giving off, and I could not have been more on top of the world. But sadly, that very late in that pregnancy, I lost the baby, and my world fell apart. Absolutely everything came under review, because I thought I knew what my purpose was in the world. I mean, sadly, losing the baby and losing the relationship I was in and losing the home I lived in was one side of it, because I knew that pathway, and I knew what I was expecting to happen. So I trusted the world a certain way. I trusted God. I trusted life, trusted the universe. This was the pathway. This was what was going to happen in the next few months, and things would unfold. And I was meeting with all this sort of success in my life, and everything seemed to make sense. But on the other side of it was my vocation and my purpose and my reason for my existence. And that suddenly didn't make any sense. You know, I thought I was put on this world, on this planet, to tell women that our physical bodies are the result of millions and millions of cycles of childbirth. And here we are, you need to reclaim it. You need to trust in the process and use your breathing, trust your body. Even if medical intervention is necessary, you can still deal with it with a mindset that feels empowered. I believe all of those things, and they still all stand. But suddenly I felt like such a fraud espousing them. I felt I don't have a baby. I had put absolute faith and trust in my body, and my body doesn't work. Everything I've said is a joke. And what kind of a joke is this that God has played on me? And so it's a real existential crisis. And it really was the gift of despair, because I didn't know who I was, what my purpose was, where I belonged in the world. And actually I stopped being able to expect. And many people have talked about when we remove hope from people, that's one of the most devastating points. I mean, Viktor Frankl, who we were talking about earlier, he talks about that when you remove hope from people as well, they can also start to perish and decline. And I didn't have hope. And the only mantra that could see me through that period was presence in the present. Presence in the present, because I couldn't dare to hope for the future. All hope was dashed against the rocks. So I just had presence in the present. And I knew that I had to ask myself, in this very moment right now, am I okay? And as long as I was okay, not too hungry, not cold, not too warm, all of that, then I was okay. And it took me a long time. And that was when I started to work with people in addiction recovery, because I needed, I got my value and I got my worth through helping those other people. And there was something else on that strand that I think is worth saying, that when I got to the end of that 5-year period of helping people in addiction recovery, I recognized that my self-worth was so focused on helping other people change that I was actually using it as a defense from facing myself, and really, just giving that compassion and care to myself. I would do anything to help other people change, and I felt great when other people transformed their lives. It was absolutely miraculous and amazing. But I did it at my own cost.
Yeah. I mean, look, there is something amazing about being told, this is the woman that helped me learn to smile again. Yeah,
wonderful.
That is fantastic. You can't beat that. But if you are doing that to the detriment of your own self, that is always going to be a problem, isn't it? And I mean, what you just said makes me think, well, recovery. It's not just for addicts. Everyone should try it sometime.
True.
And that seems like, that was your process of recovery. And it was about building that kind of self-awareness. Now, one of the things that I come across quite a lot with self-awareness is that people are actually quite good at becoming aware of the stuff that they've done wrong in their life.
Yeah.
That's part of the journey that certain methodologies will take you down. It really is about understanding all of your flaws. But then people often struggle with the perfect bit. People struggle much more accepting what they do well than what they do badly. So is there a danger by focusing on people's flaws too much that we're not kind of focusing on the stuff that makes us amazing and makes us powerful and makes us truly unique human beings?
Well, I think that was maybe where the hope idea kind of comes back in, because it took quite a lot of courage at that time, say for me, to start hoping again and saying, I can be successful. I can go after goals. I can strive for things, because it seemed such a risk to do that, where I got into this very safe, detached place. Yeah, I'll accept everything about me in the moment. I can be completely flawed and human, but yes, there was no what about stepping up or being more or going after things, because I think you can face challenges by being very detached from them, just as you can face relationships by being very detached and not being too close to anyone. We can avoid intimacy of ourselves, and also we can avoid putting ourselves at risk of failure by being not going after success. So yeah, that's definitely, I definitely think going after success is an important part of it. I wouldn't say that's a perfect thing.
No. So we've talked a little bit about liberation, and one of the things I was thinking about when we first started talking about this podcast is what is the freedom? I mean, what are you offering people in terms of that liberation and that freedom?
That's a really good question, and I think one of the challenges that we face is the denial of our own value, our own voice. So I work with people to help them find their story. I work with people with my book, Your Leadership Story, is a program for speakers or other people, storytellers, people with a message to share, to find the story that they have to share with people. But even more importantly than that is to find a way of being really true to themselves and really authentic and showing up as themselves. Gandhi said that, a well-worn phrase, which we've heard many times, be the change you want to see in the world. But I think there's nothing more important than us going through the crucible of being that change, showing up as ourselves. And it's our stories and our experiences that inspire people when we understand where they fit within the context of who we are as a human being.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, apart from the fact that I don't think it was Gandhi that said it, I think it was Google. But I totally agree with you. I mean, showing people that there is a different way, that's just about the most powerful thing that you can do to help somebody to change, I think.
And I do think it's worth saying, that as a woman growing up, or as a girl growing up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was when I was 16, or even when I was 13, I looked much older than I was. When I was 13, I'm tall, blonde hair, and I really sort of stuck out. And it was an era where it was absolutely okay for builders to go, all right, darling, and it was.
It wasn't okay, but it did happen quite a lot more.
It seemed okay. I mean,
nobody would put them up on it.
No, I mean, Benny Hill was on television. It was, it's an environment where there was, it's quite a predatory environment, and I certainly came a cropper to some, quite serious predatory behaviours, and there was no one there sort of helping me make sense of that. And I found that what I did was I wanted to hide, and I wanted to hide. Kind of had this this inner conflict between wanting to hide and wanting to share my self-expression. And, even I've always been a little bit quirky. I've always been a bit unusual, a bit different. And I feel like, one of the worst things that people could have said to me at school was, oh, she's a bit weird. I hated anyone thinking I was weird. Now I know being weird is a wonderful thing. I know because, over the years, I've started to move into what is my new vocation, which is as a speaker, as a communicator, and as somebody who helps people to open up to who they truly can be and to show up as their true and wonderful selves. And so I've had a big, I suppose, period of life, even more recently, with having to have the confidence to have my voice heard and not to be the objectified tall blonde girl that I was in my younger years. Now, quite nice if I'm occasionally objectified. I don't mind. But, it's pretty difficult. It's quite difficult getting that balance and hiding my voice and hiding myself and conforming and wanting to fit in. And now I think with the onset of AI and the world of machine learning and everything else, the more we don't fit in, the more we see things differently, the more we have unusual ideas, the more we're quirky, and the more we have real, true connection between other people, which comes from a true connection with ourselves. Those are the real assets that we've got in the world as we go forward.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned balance again, and that's something that you've talked about a few times already today. And I think that's what I'm getting from talking to you. It's a difficult balance. It's a hard path to walk. So, well, look, just before we wrap stuff up, I did want to share something with you that I heard on the audiobook this morning. And he said that the problem with most people is they're trying to be godlike when they should be looking to just be wholeheartedly human.
Love that. Love that. That's on 40,000 weeks, was it?
Well, I think 40,000 weeks is probably a bit optimistic. It's called 4,000 weeks. If you're planning on living 40,000 weeks, you're going to set some records.
So, yes, being a wholehearted human. And I also love that phrase, which is the shortest distance between two people is laughter. And I think it is about being lighthearted and joyful, and at the same time having those moments of care and gentleness. Be gentle with our dreams, be gentle with our souls, and care for them whilst laughing. And I also like the idea that we can only be as close to another human being as we are able to be to ourselves. And that is that soul that I was talking about before. How close are we able to be to the truth of who we are? And how much are we putting on a facade or a persona that gets us through the day? And we all do a bit of that. It does get us through the day. It's important. It's valuable. But I think in my own path, as I show up more and more on stage or on something like this podcast, that there's a greater and greater requirement to show up as me and do away with that persona.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I mean, look, I am in podcast mode. If I was a plastic doll, I would be podcast Duncan, wouldn't I? You should have seen me at 6:15 this morning. I was sweating and looked terrible in running mode, Duncan.
True. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So there are lots of different types of us. I don't think I've been inauthentic today by actually showering and putting on some reasonably clean clothes.
Well, absolutely. We want to show up as our best selves. And I don't think there is any conflict between, I just got my hair done before I came on today. There's no conflict between showing up as the best version of us and being flawed. Being flawed is the human quality of being really true and really honest and the person that we are in the world.
Oh, that's a brilliant point to wrap it all up. But how can the listeners find out more about the amazing work you do, Deborah?
Well, I could ask the same of you, because I want to thank you so much for taking your time to speak to me. They can find more about the amazing work I do by just going to deborahhenley.com, which is my website. But I'm very happy for them to just listen to the next episodes of this. We've got some amazing interviewees, some guests who are going to just knock people's socks off with the honesty and bravery at which they talk about their flaws and how they've come through them, and more importantly, how they've been changed through the process of facing despair or discouragement or something else, but disillusionment. And you're definitely actually going to interview them. You're not just getting a new person to interview you every week. That is the plan. No, this is all that you're probably going to hear about me. Although who knows what I'll slip in. But I want to say thank you so much, Duncan. How can people hear more about the amazing work you do?
So, look, your listeners, I'm sure, are very lovely people. So I'd like to offer them a little gift. If they want to take a look at my first book, Get Over Indulgence, just put getover.uk into your search engine of choice. It's getover.uk, take you to a bit of my website. You can download a PDF copy of that or a Kindle copy, but it's also my website, so you can find out more about the stuff that I do. The socials are on there, so you can get in touch.
Well, you do amazing work, and that's a very generous offer. So I really highly recommend everybody reads your book, whether or not you're overindulgent or not. So thanks very much, Duncan.
It's an absolute pleasure, and good luck with the rest of the podcast.
Well, thank you to Duncan Bascaran-Brown for interviewing me, and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and found something valuable from it. I found it particularly useful to discover what it's like to be on the other side of the table and to contemplate what perfectly flawed really means when somebody's asking me in the moment. I'm sure it's going to stand me in good stead with my future guests, and I really look forward to interviewing all the others. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you like it and you leave a review. It makes such a difference to us. And also share it with anyone else who you think could benefit from listening to this episode. Also, make sure that you subscribe, because that way you won't miss out on any future episodes. And we've got some really great ones coming up, as well as some fantastic ones in our back catalogue.